Chapter 4. It had been arranged that Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins, traveling together, should arrive at San Salvatore on the evening of March 31st. The owner, who told them how to get there, appreciated their disinclination to begin their time in it on April 1st, and Lady Caroline and Mrs. Fisher, as yet unacquainted and therefore under no obligations to bore each other on the journey, for only towards the end would they find out by a process of sifting who they were to arrive on the morning of April 2nd. In this way, everything would be got nicely ready for the two who seemed, in spite of the equality of the sharing, yet to have something about them of guests. There were disagreeable incidents towards the end of March, when Mrs. Wilkins, her heart in her mouth and her face a mixture of guilt, terror, and determination, told her husband that she had been invited to Italy, and he declined to believe it. Of course he declined to believe it. Nobody had ever invited his wife to Italy before. There was no precedent. He required proofs. The only proof was Mrs. Arbuthnot, and Mrs. Wilkins had produced her. But after what entreaties, what passionate persuading, for Mrs. Arbuthnot had not imagined she would have to face Mr. Wilkins and say things to him that were short of the truth, and it brought home to her what she had for some time suspected, that she was slipping more and more away from God. Indeed, the whole of March was filled with unpleasant, anxious moments. It was an uneasy month. Mrs. Arbuthnot's conscience, made supersensitive by years of pampering, could not reconcile what she was doing with its own high standard of what was right. It gave her little peace. It nudged her at her prayers. It punctuated her entreaties for divine guidance with disconcerting questions such as, "Are you not a hypocrite? Do you really mean that? Would you not, frankly, be disappointed if that prayer were granted?" The prolonged, wet, raw weather was on the side, too, of her conscience, producing far more sickness than usual among the poor. They had bronchitis, they had fevers, there was no end to the distress. And here she was, going off, spending precious money on going off, simply and solely to be happy. One woman being happy, and these piteous multitudes. She was unable to look the vicar in the face. He did not know, nobody knew, what she was going to do, and from the very beginning she was unable to look anybody in the face. She excused herself for making speeches appealing for money. How could she stand up and ask people for money when she herself was spending so much on her own selfish pleasure? Nor did it help her or quiet her that, having actually told Frederick, in her desire to make up for what she was squandering, that she would be grateful if he would let her have some money, he instantly gave her a check for £100. He asked no questions. She was scarlet. He looked at her a moment and then looked away. It was a relief to Frederick that she should take some money. She gave it all immediately to the organization she worked with, and found herself more tangled in doubts than ever. Mrs. Wilkins, on the contrary, had no doubts. She was quite certain that it was the most proper thing to have a holiday, and altogether right and beautiful to spend one's own hard-collected savings on being happy. "Think how much nicer we shall be when we come back," she said to Mrs. Arbuthnot, encouraging that pale lady. No, Mrs. Wilkins had no doubts, but she had fears, and March was for her, too, an anxious month, with the unconscious Mr. Wilkins coming back daily to his dinner and eating his fish in the silence of imagined security. Also, things happen so awkwardly. It really is astonishing how awkwardly they happen. Mrs. Wilkins, who was very careful all this month to give Mellersh only the food he liked, buying it and hovering over its cooking with a zeal more than common, succeeded so well that Mellersh was pleased, definitely pleased, so much pleased that he began to think that he might, after all, have married the right wife instead of, as he had very frequently suspected, the wrong one. The result was that on the third Sunday in the month, Mrs. Wilkins had made up her trembling mind that on the fourth Sunday, there being 5 in that March, and it being on the 5th of them that she and Mrs. Arbuthnot were to start, she would tell Mellersh of her invitation. On the third Sunday, then, after a very well-cooked lunch in which the Yorkshire pudding had melted in his mouth and the apricot tart had been so perfect that he ate it all, Mellersh, smoking his cigar by the brightly burning fire, the white hail gusts banged on the window, said, "I am thinking of taking you to Italy for Easter," and paused for her astounded and grateful ecstasy. None came. The silence in the room, except for the hail hitting the windows and the gay roar of the fire, was complete. Mrs. Wilkins could not speak. She was dumbfounded. The next Sunday was the day she had meant to break her news to him, and she had not yet even prepared the form of words in which she would break it. Mr. Wilkins, who had not been abroad since before the war, and was noticing with increasing disgust, as week followed week of wind and rain, the peculiar persistence, vileness of the weather, had slowly conceived a desire to get away from England for Easter. He was doing very well in his business. He could afford a trip. Switzerland was useless in April. There was a familiar sound about Easter in Italy. To Italy he would go, and as it would cause comment if he did not take his wife, take her he must. Besides, she would be useful. A second person was always useful in a country whose language one did not speak, for holding things, for waiting with the luggage. He had expected an explosion of gratitude and excitement. The absence of it was incredible. She could not, he concluded, have heard. Probably she was absorbed in some foolish daydream. It was regrettable how childish she remained. He turned his head, their chairs were in front of the fire, and looked at her. She was staring straight into the fire, and it was no doubt the fire that made her face so red. "I am thinking," he repeated, raising his clear, cultivated voice and speaking with acerbity, for inattention at such a moment was deplorable, "of taking you to Italy for Easter. Did you not hear me?" Yes, she had heard him, and she had been wondering at the extraordinary coincidence, really most extraordinary. She was just going to tell him how she had been invited. A friend had invited her. Easter, too. Easter was in April, wasn't it? Her friend had a house there. In fact, Mrs. Wilkins, driven by terror, guilt, and surprise, had been more incoherent, if possible, than usual. It was a dreadful afternoon. Mellersh, profoundly indignant, besides having his intended treat coming back on him like a blessing to Ruth, cross-examined her with the utmost severity. He demanded that she refuse the invitation. He demanded that, since she had so outrageously accepted it without consulting him, she should write and cancel her acceptance. Finding himself up against an unsuspected, shocking rock of obstinacy, sorry, Mom, before her, or in her, he then declined to believe she had been invited to Italy at all. He declined to believe in this Mrs. Arbuthnot, of whom, till that moment, he had never heard. And it was only when the gentle creature was brought round, with such difficulty, with such a desire on her part to throw the whole thing up rather than tell Mr. Wilkins less than the truth, and herself endorsed his wife's statements, that he was able to give them credence. He could not but believe Mrs. Arbuthnot. She produced the precise effect on him that she did on tube officials. She hardly needed to say anything, but that made no difference to her conscience, which knew and would not let her forget that she had given him an incomplete impression. "Do you," asked her conscience, "see any real difference between an incomplete impression and a completely stated lie?" God sees none. The remainder of March was a confused, bad dream. Both Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins were shattered. Try as they would not, too, both felt extremely guilty. And when, on the morning of the 30th, they did finally get off, there was no exhilaration about the departure, no holiday feeling at all. "We've been too good, much too good," Mrs. Wilkins kept on, murmuring as they walked up and down the platform at Victoria, having arrived there an hour before they needed to have. "And that's why we feel as though we're doing wrong. We're browbeaten. We're not any longer real human beings. Real human beings aren't ever as good as we've been. Oh," she clenched her thin hands, "to think that we ought to be so happy now, here on the very station, actually starting, and we're not, and it's being spoiled for us simply because we've spoiled them. What have we done? What have we done? I should like to know," she inquired of Mrs. Arbuthnot indignantly, "except for once want to get away by ourselves and have a little rest from them." Mrs. Arbuthnot, patiently pacing, did not ask who she meant by them, because she knew. Mrs. Wilkins meant their husbands, persisting in her assumption that Frederick was as indignant as Mellersh over the departure of his wife, whereas Frederick did not even know his wife had gone. Mrs. Arbuthnot, always silent about him, had said nothing of this to Mrs. Wilkins. Frederick went too deep into her heart for her to talk about him. He was having an extra bout of work finishing another one of those dreadful books, and had been away practically continually the last few weeks, and was away when she left. Why should she tell him beforehand? Sure as she so miserably was that he would have no objection to anything she did, she merely wrote him a note and put it on the hall table, ready for him if and when he should come home. She said she was going for a month's holiday, as she needed a rest and she had not had one for so long, and that Gladys, the efficient parlor maid, had orders to see to his comforts. She did not say where she was going. There was no reason why she should. He would not be interested. He would not care. The day was wretched, blustering, and wet. The crossing was atrocious, and they were very sick. But after having been very sick, just to arrive at Calais and not be sick was happiness, and it was there that the real splendor of what they were doing first began to warm their benumbed spirits. It got hold of Mrs. Wilkins first and spread from her like a rose-colored flame over her pale companion. Mellersh at Calais, where they restored themselves with souls because of Mrs. Wilkins' desire to eat a soul Mellersh wasn't having. Mellersh at Calais had already begun to dwindle and seem less important. None of the French porters knew him. Not a single official at Calais cared a fig for Mellersh. In Paris, there was no time to think of him because their train was late and they only just caught the Turin train at the Gare de Lyon. And by the afternoon of the next day, when they got into Italy, England, Frederick, Mellersh, the vicar, the poor, Hampstead, the club, Shoolbred, everything, the whole inflamed sore dreariness had faded to the dimness of a dream. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. It was cloudy in Italy, which surprised them. They had expected brilliant sunshine, but never mind, it was Italy and the very clouds looked fat. Neither of them had ever been there before. Both gazed out of the windows with rapt faces. The hours flew as long as it was daylight, and after that there was the excitement of getting nearer, getting quite near, getting there. At Genoa, it had begun to rain. Genoa. Imagine actually being at Genoa, seeing its name written up in the station just like any other name. At Nervi, it was pouring, and when at last towards midnight, for again the train was late, they got to Mezzago, the rain was coming down in what seemed solid sheets. But it was Italy. Nothing it did could be bad. The very rain was different, straight rain, falling properly onto one's umbrella, not violently blowing like that English stuff that got in everywhere. And it did leave off, and when it did, behold, the earth would be strewn with roses. Mr. Briggs, San Salvatore's owner, had said, "You get out at Mezzago, and then you drive." But he had forgotten what he amply knew, that trains in Italy are sometimes late, and he had imagined his tenants arriving at Mezzago at 8 o'clock and finding a string of flies to choose from. The train was 4 hours late, and when Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins scrambled down the ladder-like high steps of their carriage into the black downpour, their skirts sweeping off great pools of sooty wet because their hands were full of suitcases, if it had not been for the vigilance of Domenico, the gardener at San Salvatore, they would have found nothing for them to drive in. All ordinary flies had long since gone home. Domenico, foreseeing this, had sent his aunt's fly, driven by her son, his cousin, and his aunt and her fly lived in Castagneto, the village crouching at the feet of San Salvatore. And therefore, however late the train was, the fly would not dare come home without containing that which it had been set to fetch. Domenico's cousin's name was Beppo, and he presently emerged out of the dark where Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins stood, uncertain what to do next after the train had gone on, for they could see no porter, and they thought, from the feel of it, that they were standing not so much on a platform as in the middle of the permanent way. Beppo, who had been searching for them, emerged from the dark with a kind of pounce and talked Italian to them vociferously. Beppo was a most respectable young man, but he did not look as if he were, especially not in the dark, and he had a dripping hat slouched over one eye. They did not like the way he seized their suitcases. He could not be, they thought, a porter. However, they presently, from out of his streaming talk, discerned the words San Salvatore, and after that they kept on saying them to him, for it was the only Italian they knew, as they hurried after him, unwilling to lose sight of their suitcases, stumbling across rails and through puddles out to where, in the road, a small high fly stood. Its hood was up, and its horse was in an attitude of thought. They climbed in, and the minute they were in, Mrs. Wilkins, indeed, could hardly be called in, the horse awoke with a start from its reverie and immediately began going home rapidly, without Beppo, without the suitcases. Beppo darted after him, making the night ring with his shouts, and caught the hanging reins just in time. He explained proudly, and as it seemed to him with perfect clearness, that the horse always did that, being a fine animal full of corn and blood, and cared for by him, Beppo, as if he were his own son, and the ladies must not be alarmed. He had noticed they were clutching each other, but clear and loud and profuse of words though he was, they only looked at him blankly. He went on talking, however, while he pulled the suitcases up round them, sure that sooner or later they must understand him, especially as he was careful to talk very loud and illustrate everything he said with the simplest elucidatory gestures. But they both continued only to look at him. They both, he noticed sympathetically, had white faces, fatigued faces, and they both had big eyes, fatigued eyes. They were beautiful ladies, he thought, and their eyes, looking at him over the tops of the suitcases, watching his every movement. There were no trunks, only numbers of suitcases, were like the eyes of the Mother of God. The only thing the ladies said, and they repeated it at regular intervals, even after they had started, gently prodding him as he sat on his box to call his attention to it, was, San Salvatore? And each time he answered vociferously, encouragingly, Si, San Salvatore. We don't know, of course, if he's taking us there, said Mrs. Arbuthnot at last in a low voice, after they had been driving, as it seemed to them, a long while, and had got off the paving stone of the sleep-shrouded town, and were out on a winding road with what they could just see was a low wall on their left beyond, which was a great black emptiness and the sound of the sea. On their right was something close and steep and high and black. Rocks, they whispered to each other, huge rocks. No, we don't know, agreed Mrs. Wilkins, a slight coldness passing down her spine. They felt very uncomfortable. It was so late. It was so dark. The road was so lonely. Suppose a wheel came off. Suppose they met fascisti, or the opposite of fascisti. How sorry they were now that they had not slept at Genoa and come on the next morning in daylight. But that would have been the 1st of April, said Mrs. Wilkins in a low voice. It is that now, said Mrs. Arbuthnot beneath her breath. So it is, murmured Mrs. Wilkins. They were silent. Beppo turned round on his box, a disquieting habit already noticed, for surely his horse ought to be carefully watched, and again addressed them with what he was convinced was lucidity. No patois, and the clearest explanatory movements. How much they wished their mothers had made them learn Italian when they were little. If only now they could have said, Please, sir, round the right way and look after the horse. They did not even know what horse was in Italian. It was contemptible to be so ignorant. In their anxiety, for the road twisted round great jutting rocks, and on their left was only the low wall to keep them out of the sea, should anything happen, they too began to gesticulate, waving their hands at Beppo, pointing ahead. They wanted him to turn round again and face his horse, that was all. He thought they wanted him to drive faster, and there followed a terrifying 10 minutes during which, as he supposed, he was gratifying them. He was proud of his horse, and it could go very fast. He rose in his seat, the whip cracked, the horse rushed forward, the rocks leaped towards them, the little fly swayed, the suitcases heaved, Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins clung. In this way they continued, swaying, heaving, clattering, clinging, till at a point near Castagneto there was a rise in the road, and on reaching the foot of the rise the horse, who knew every inch of the way, stopped suddenly, throwing everything in the fly into a heap, and then proceeded up at the slowest of walks. Beppo twisted himself round to receive their admiration, laughing with pride in his horse. There was no answering laugh from the beautiful ladies. Their eyes, fixed on him, seemed bigger than ever, and their faces, against the black of the night, showed milky. But here at last, once they were up the slope, were houses. The rocks left off, and there were houses. The low wall left off, and there were houses. The sea shrunk away, and the sound of it ceased, and the loneliness of the road was finished. No lights anywhere, of course, nobody to see them pass. And yet Beppo, when the houses began, after looking over his shoulder and shouting, "Castagnetto!" at the ladies, once more stood up and cracked his whip, and once more made his horse dash forward. "We shall be there in a minute," Mrs. Arbuthnot said to herself, holding on. "We shall soon stop now," Mrs. Wilkins said to herself, holding on. They said nothing aloud because nothing would have been heard above the whip cracking and the wheel clattering and the boisterous, inciting noises Beppo was making at his horse. Anxiously, they strained their eyes for any sight of the beginning of San Salvatore. They had supposed and hoped that after a reasonable amount of village, a medieval archway would loom upon them, and through it they would drive into a garden and draw up at an open, welcoming door, with light streaming from it, and those servants standing in it who, according to their advertisement, remained. Instead, the fly suddenly stopped. Peering out, they could see they were still in the village street, with small dark houses each side. And Beppo, throwing the reins over the horse's back, as if completely confident this time that he would not go any further, got down off his box. At the same moment, springing as it seemed out of nothing, a man and several half-grown boys appeared on each side of the fly and began dragging out the suitcases. No, San Salvatore, exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins, trying to hold on to what suitcases she could. Si, San Salvatore, they all shouted, pulling. This can't be San Salvatore, said Mrs. Wilkins, turning to Mrs. Arbuthnot, who sat quite still, watching her suitcases being taken from her with the same patience she applied to lesser evils. She knew she could do nothing if these men were wicked men, determined to have her suitcases. "I don't think it can be," she admitted, and could not refrain from a moment's wonder at the ways of God. Had she really been brought here, she and poor Mrs. Wilkins, after so much trouble in arranging it, so much difficulty and worry, along such devious paths of prevarication and deceit, only to be— She checked her thoughts and gently said to Mrs. Wilkins, while the ragged youths disappeared with the suitcases into the night and the men with the lantern helped Beppo pull the rug off her, that they were both in God's hands, and for the first time, on hearing this, Mrs. Wilkins was afraid. There was nothing for it but to get out, unless to try to go on, sitting in the fly, repeating San Salvatore. Every time they said it, and their voices each time were fainter, Beppo and the other men merely echoed it in a series of loud shouts. If only they had learned Italian when they were little! If only they could have said, "We wish to be driven to the door." But they did not even know what door was in Italian. Such ignorance was not only contemptible, it was, they now saw, definitely dangerous. Useless, however, to lament it now, uselessly to put off whatever it was that was going to happen to them by trying to go on sitting in the fly. They therefore got out. The two men opened their umbrellas for them and handed them to them. From this they received a faint encouragement, because they could not believe that if these men were wicked, they would pause to open umbrellas. The men with the lantern then made signs to them to follow him, talking loudly and quickly, and Beppo, they noticed, remained behind. Ought they to pay him? Not, they thought, if they were going to be robbed and perhaps murdered. Surely on such an occasion one did not pay? Besides, he had not, after all, brought them to San Salvatore. Where they had got to was evidently somewhere else. Also, he did not show the least wish to be paid. He let them go away into the night with no clamor at all. This, they could not help thinking, was a bad sign. He asked for nothing because presently he was to get so much. They came to some steps. The road ended abruptly in a church and some descending steps. The men held the lantern low for them to see the steps. "San Salvatore?" said Mrs. Wilkins once again, very faintly, before committing herself to the steps. It was useless to mention it now, of course, but she could not go down steps in complete silence. No medieval castle, she was sure, was ever built at the bottom of steps. Again, however, came the echoing shout, "Si, si, San Salvatore!" They descended gingerly, holding up their skirts just as if they would be wanting them another time, and had not, in all probability, finished with skirts forever. The steps ended in a steeply sloping path with flat stone slabs in the middle. They slipped a good deal on these wet slabs, and the man with the lantern, talking loud and quickly, held them up. His way of holding them up was polite. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Wilkins in a low voice to Mrs. Arbuthnot, "it is all right after all." "We are in God's hands," said Mrs. Arbuthnot again, and again Mrs. Wilkins was afraid. They reached the bottom of the sloping path, and the light of the lantern flickered over an open space with houses round 3 sides. The sea was the 4th side, lazily washing backwards and forwards on pebbles. "San Salvatore," said the man, pointing with his lantern to a black mass curved round the water like an arm flung about it. They strained their eyes. They saw the black mass, and on the top of it, a light. "San Salvatore?" they both repeated incredulously. For where were the suitcases, and why had they been forced to get out of the fly? "Si, si, San Salvatore." They went along what seemed to be a quay, right on the edge of the water. There was not even a low wall here, nothing to prevent the man with the lantern tipping them in if he wanted to. He did not, however, tip them in. Perhaps it was all right after all, Mrs. Wilkins again suggested to Mrs. Arbuthnot on noticing this, who this time was herself beginning to think that it might be, and said no more about God's hands. The flicker of the lantern danced along, reflected in the wet pavement of the quay. Out to the left in the darkness, and evidently at the end of a jetty, was a red light. They came to an archway with a heavy iron gate. The man with the lantern pushed the gate open. This time they went up steps instead of down, and at the top of them was a little path that wound upwards among flowers. They could not see the flowers, but the whole place was evidently full of them. It here dawned on Mrs. Wilkins that perhaps the reason why the fly had not driven them up to the door was that there was no road, only a footpath. That also would explain the disappearance of the suitcases. She began to feel confident that they would find their suitcases waiting for them when they got up to the top. San Salvatore was, it seemed, on the top of a hill, as a medieval castle should be. At a turn of the path they saw above them, much nearer now and shining more brightly, the light they had seen from the quay. She told Mrs. Arbuthnot of her dawning belief, and Mrs. Arbuthnot agreed that it was very likely a true one. Once more, but this time in a tone of real hopefulness, Mrs. Wilkins said, pointing upwards at the black outline against this only slightly less black sky, "San Salvatore?" And once more, but this time, comfortingly, encouragingly, came back the assurance, "Si, si, San Salvatore." They crossed a little bridge over what was apparently a ravine, and then came to a flat bit with long grass at the sides and more flowers. They felt the grass flicking wet against their stockings, and the invisible flowers were everywhere. Then up again through trees, along a zigzag path with the smell all the way of the flowers they could not see. The warm rain was bringing out all the sweetness. Higher and higher they went in this sweet darkness, and the red light on the jetty dropped further and further below. The path wound round to the other side of what appeared to be a little peninsula. The jetty and the red light disappeared. Across the emptiness, on their left, were distant lights. "Mezzago," said the man, waving his lantern at the lights. "Si, si," they answered, for they had by now learned "si, si." Upon which the man congratulated them in a great flow of polite words, not one of which they understood, on their magnificent Italian. For this was Domenico, the vigilant and accomplished gardener of San Salvatore, the prop and stay of the establishment, the resourceful, the gifted, the eloquent, the courteous, the intelligent Domenico. Only they did not know that yet, and he did in the dark, and even sometimes in the light, look, with his knife-sharp, swarthy features and swift panther movements, very like somebody wicked. They passed along another flat bit of path, with a black shape like a high wall towering above them on their right, and then the path went up again under trellises and trailing sprays of scented things, caught at them, and shook raindrops at them, and the light of the lantern flickered over lilies, and then came a flight of ancient steps worn with centuries, and then another iron gate, and then they were inside, though still climbing a twisting flight of stone steps with old walls on either side like the walls of a dungeon, and with a vaulted roof. At the top was a wrought iron door, and through it shone a flood of electric light. "Ecco," said Domenico, lithely running up the last few steps ahead and pushing the door open. And there they were, arrived, and it was San Salvatore, and their suitcases were waiting for them, and they had not been murdered. They looked at each other's white faces and blinking eyes very solemnly. It was a great, a wonderful moment. Here they were in their medieval castle at last. Their feet touched its stones. Mrs. Wilkins put her arm round Mrs. Arbuthnot's neck and kissed her. "The first thing to happen in this house," she said softly, solemnly, "shall be a kiss." "Dear Lottie," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Dear Rose," said Mrs. Wilkins, her eyes brimming with gladness. Domenico was delighted. He liked to see beautiful ladies kiss. He made them a most appreciative speech of welcome, and they stood arm in arm, holding each other up, for they were very tired, blinking smilingly at him and not understanding a word. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. When Mrs. Wilkins woke next morning, she lay in bed a few minutes before getting up and opening the shutters. What would she see out of her window? A shining world or a world of rain? But it would be beautiful. Whatever it was would be beautiful. She was in a little bedroom with bare white walls and a stone floor and sparse old furniture. The beds, there were two, were made of iron, enameled black and painted with bunches of gay flowers. She lay, putting off the great moment of going to the window as one puts off opening a precious letter, gloating over it. She had no idea what time it was. She had forgotten to wind up her watch ever since, centuries ago, she last went to bed in Hampstead. No sounds were to be heard in the house, so she supposed it was very early. Yet she felt as if she had slept for a long while, so completely rested, so perfectly content. She lay with her arms clasped round her head, thinking how happy she was, her lips curved upwards in a delighted smile. In bed by herself, adorable condition. She had not been in bed without Mellersh once now for 5 whole years, and the cool roominess of it, the freedom of one's movements, the sense of recklessness, of audacity in giving the blankets a pull if one wanted to, or twitching the pillows more comfortable. It was like the discovery of an entirely new joy. Mrs. Wilkins longed to get up and open the shutters, but where she was so very delicious. She gave a sigh of contentment and went on lying there, looking round her, taking in everything in her room, her own little room, her very own to arrange just as she pleased for this one blessed month. Her room bought with her own savings, the fruit of her careful denials, whose door she could bolt if she wanted to, and nobody had the right to come in. It was such a strange little room, so different from any she had known, and so sweet. It was like a cell. Except for the 2 beds, it suggested a happy austerity. And the name of the chamber, she thought, quoting and smiling round at it, was Peace. Well, this was delicious, to lie there thinking how happy she was. But outside those shutters it was more delicious still. She jumped up, pulled on her slippers, for there was nothing on the stone floor but one small rug, ran to the window and threw open the shutters. "Oh!" cried Mrs. Wilkins. All the radiance of April in Italy lay gathered together at her feet. The sun poured in on her, the sea lay asleep in it, hardly stirring. Across the bay, the lovely mountains, exquisitely different in color, were asleep too in the light, and underneath her window, at the bottom of the flower-starred grass slope from which the wall of the castle rose up, was a great cypress, cutting through the delicate blues and violets and rose colors of the mountains and the sea like a great black sword. She stared. Such beauty, and she there to see it. Such beauty, and she alive to feel it. Her face was bathed in light. Lovely scents came up to the window and caressed her. A tiny breeze gently lifted her hair. Far out in the bay, a cluster of almost motionless fishing boats hovered like a flock of white birds on the tranquil sea. How beautiful, how beautiful, not to have died before this, to have been allowed to see, breathe, feel this. She stared, her lips parted, happy, poor, ordinary, everyday word. But what could one say? How could one describe it? It was as though she could hardly stay inside herself. It was as though she were too small to hold so much of joy. It was as though she were washed through with light. And how astonishing to feel this sheer bliss, for here she was, not doing and not going to do a single unselfish thing, not going to do a thing she didn't want to do. According to everybody she had ever come across, she ought to at least have twinges. She had not one twinge. Something was wrong somewhere. Wonderful that at home she should have been so good, so terribly good, and merely felt tormented. Twinges of every sort had there been her portion, aches, hurts, discouragements, and she the whole time being steadily unselfish. Now she had taken off her goodness and left it behind her like a heap of rain-sodden clothes, and she only felt joy. She was naked of goodness and was rejoicing in being naked. She was stripped at exulting, and there, away in the dim mugginess of Hampstead, was Mellersh being angry. She tried to visualize Mellersh. She tried to see him having breakfast and thinking bitter things about her. And lo, Mellersh himself began to shimmer, became rose color, became delicate violet, became an enchanting blue, became formless, became iridescent. Actually, Mellersh, after quivering a minute, was lost in light. Well, thought Mrs. Wilkins, staring as it were after him, how extraordinary not to be able to visualize Mellersh, and she who used to know every feature, every expression of his by heart. She simply could not see him as he was. She could only see him resolved into beauty, melted into harmony with everything else. The familiar words of the general thanksgiving came quite naturally into her mind, and she found herself blessing God for her creation, preservation, and all the blessings of this life, but above all for his inestimable love, out loud in a burst of acknowledgment, while Mellersh, at that moment angrily pulling on his boots before going out into the dripping streets, was indeed thinking bitter things about her. She began to dress, choosing clean white clothes in honor of the summer's day, unpacking her suitcases, tidying her adorable little room. She moved about with quick, purposeful steps, her long, thin body held up straight, her small face, so much puckered at home with effort and fear, smoothed out. All she had been and done before this morning, all she had felt and worried about, was gone. Each of her worries behaved as the image of Mellersh had behaved, and dissolved into color and light. And she noticed things she had not noticed for years. When she was doing her hair in front of the glass, she noticed it and thought, "Why, what pretty stuff!" For years she had forgotten she had such a thing as hair, plaiting it in the evening and unplaiting it in the morning with the same hurry and indifference with which she laced and unlaced her shoes. Now she suddenly saw it, and she twisted it round her fingers before the glass, and was glad it was so pretty. Mellersh couldn't have seen it either, for he had never said a word about it. Well, when she got home, she would draw his attention to it. "Mellersh," she would say, "look at my hair. Aren't you pleased you've got a wife with hair like curly honey?" She laughed. She had never said anything like that to Mellersh yet, and the idea of it amused her. But why had she not? Oh yes, she used to be afraid of him. Funny to be afraid of anybody, and especially of one's husband, whom one saw in his more simplified moments, such as asleep and not breathing properly through his nose. When she was ready, she opened her door to go across to see if Rose, who had been put the night before by a sleepy maidservant into a cell opposite, were awake. She would say good morning to her, and then she would run down and stay with that cypress tree till breakfast was ready. And after breakfast, she wouldn't so much as look out of a window till she had helped Rose get everything ready for Lady Caroline and Mrs. Fisher. There was much to be done that day, settling in, arranging the rooms. She mustn't leave Rose to do it alone. They would make it all so lovely for the two to come, have such an entrancing vision ready for them of little cells bright with flowers. She remembered she had wanted Lady Caroline not to come, Fancy wanting to shut someone out of heaven because she thought she would be shy of her. And as though it mattered if she were, and as though she would be anything so self-conscious as shy. Besides, what a reason! She could not accuse herself of goodness over that, and she remembered she had wanted not to have Mrs. Fisher either, because she had seemed lofty. How funny of her! So funny to worry about such little things, making them important. The bedrooms and 2 of the sitting rooms at San Salvatore were on the top floor, and opened into a roomy hall with a wide glass window at the north end. San Salvatore was rich in small gardens in different places and on different levels. The garden this window looked down on was made on the highest part of the walls, and could only be reached through the corresponding spacious hall on the floor below. When Mrs. Wilkins came out of her room, this window stood wide open, and beyond it, in the sun, was a Judas tree in full flower. There was no sign of anybody, no sound of voices or feet. Tubes of arum lilies stood about on the stone floor, and on a table flamed a huge bunch of fierce nasturtiums. Spacious, flowery, silent, with the wide window at the end opening into the garden, and the Judas tree absurdly beautiful in the sunshine. It seemed to Mrs. Wilkins, arrested on her way across to Mrs. Arbuthnot, too good to be true. Was she really going to live in this for a whole month? Up to now, she had to take what beauty she could as she went along, snatching at little bits of it when she came across it, a patch of daisies on a fine day in a Hampstead field, a flash of sunset between 2 chimney pots. She had never been in definitely, completely beautiful places. She had never even been in a venerable house, and such a thing as a profusion of flowers in her rooms was unattainable to her. Sometimes in the spring she had bought 6 tulips at Shoolbred's, unable to resist them, conscious that Mellish, if he knew what they had cost, would think it inexcusable. But they had soon died, and then there were no more. As for the Judas tree, she hadn't an idea what it was, and gazed at it out there against the sky with the rapt expression of one who sees a heavenly vision. Mrs. Arbuthnot, coming out of her room, found her there like that, standing in the middle of the hall, staring. Now what does she think she sees now? Thought Mrs. Arbuthnot. We are in God's hands, said Mrs. Wilkins, turning to her, speaking with extreme conviction. Oh, said Mrs. Arbuthnot quickly, her face, which had been covered with smiles when she came out of her room, falling. Why, what has happened? For Mrs. Arbuthnot had woken up with such a delightful feeling of security, of relief, and she did not want to find she had not after all escaped from the need of refuge. She had not even dreamed of Frederick. For the first time for years she had been spared the nightly dream that he was with her, that they were heart to heart, and its miserable awakening. She had slept like a baby, and had woken up confident. She had found there was nothing she wished to say in her morning prayer except, "Thank you." It was disconcerting to be told she was after all in God's hands. I hope nothing has happened, she asked anxiously. Mrs. Wilkins looked at her a moment and laughed. How funny, she said, kissing her. What is funny, said Mrs. Arbuthnot, her face clearing because Mrs. Wilkins laughed. We are. This is. Everything. It's all so wonderful. It's so funny and so adorable that we should be in it. I dare say when we finally reach heaven, the one they talk about so much, we shan't find it a bit more beautiful. Mrs. Arbuthnot relaxed to smiling security again. Isn't it divine, she said. Were you ever in your life so happy? Asked Mrs. Wilkins, catching her by the arm. No, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. Nor had she been, not ever, not even in her first love days with Frederick, because always pain had been close at hand in that other happiness, ready to torture with doubts, to torture even with the very excess of her love. Well, this was the simple happiness of complete harmony with her surroundings, the happiness that asks for nothing, that just accepts, just breathes, just is. Let's go and look at that tree close, said Mrs. Wilkins. I don't believe it can only be a tree. And arm in arm they went along the hall, and their husbands would not have known them, their faces were so young with eagerness, and together they stood at the open window, and when their eyes, having feasted on the marvelous pink thing, wandered farther among the beauties of the garden, they saw, sitting on the low wall at the east edge of it, gazing out over the bay, her feet in lilies, Lady Caroline. They were astonished. They said nothing in their astonishment, but stood quite still, arm in arm, staring down at her. She, too, had on a white frock, and her head was bare. They had no idea that day in London, when her hat was down to her nose and her furs were up to her ears, that she was so pretty. They had merely thought her different from the other women in the club, and so had the other women themselves, and so had all the waitresses, eyeing her sideways and eyeing her again as they passed the corner where she sat talking. But they had no idea she was so pretty. She was exceedingly pretty. Everything about her was very much that which it was. Her fair hair was very fair. Her lovely gray eyes were very lovely and gray. Her dark eyelashes were very dark. Her white skin was very white. Her red mouth was very red. She was extravagantly slender, the merest thread of a girl, though not without little curves beneath her thin frock where little curves should be. She was looking out across the bay and was sharply defined against the background of empty blue. She was full in the sun. Her feet dangled among the leaves and flowers of the lilies, just as if did not matter that they should be bent or bruised. "She ought to have a headache," whispered Mrs. Arbuthnot at last, "sitting there in the sun like that." "She ought to have a hat," whispered Mrs. Wilkins. "She's treading on lilies, but they're hers as much as ours, only 1/4 of them." Lady Caroline turned her head. She looked up at them a moment, surprised to see them so much younger than they had seemed that day at the club, and so much less unattractive. Indeed, they were really almost quite attractive, if anyone could ever be really quite attractive in the wrong clothes. Her eyes, swiftly glancing over them, took in every inch of each of them in the half-second before she smiled and waved her hand and called out good morning. There was nothing, she saw at once, to be hoped for in the way of interest from their clothes. She did not consciously think this, for she was having a violent reaction against beautiful clothes and the slavery they impose on one. Her experience being that the instant one had got them, they took one in hand and gave one no peace till they had been everywhere and been seen by everybody. You didn't take your clothes to parties, they took you. It was quite a mistake to think that a woman, a really well-dressed woman, wore out her clothes. It was the clothes that wore out the woman, dragging her about at all hours of the day and night. No wonder men stayed young longer. Just new trousers couldn't excite them. She couldn't suppose that even the newest trousers ever behaved like that, taking the bit between their teeth. Her images were disorderly, but she thought as she chose. She used what images she liked. As she got off the wall and came towards the window, it seemed a restful thing to know she was going to spend an entire month with people in dresses made, as she dimly remembered dresses used to be made 5 summers ago. "I got here yesterday morning," she said, looking up at them and smiling. She really was bewitching. She had everything, even a dimple. "It's a great pity," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, smiling back, "because we were going to choose the nicest room for you." "Oh, but I've done that," said Lady Caroline. "At least, I think it's the nicest. It looks 2 ways. I adore a room that looks 2 ways, don't you? Over the sea to the west and over this Judas tree to the north." "And we had meant to make it pretty for you with flowers," said Mrs. Wilkins. "Oh, Domenico did that. I told him to directly I got here. He's the gardener. He's wonderful." "It's a good thing, of course," said Mrs. Arbuthnot a little hesitatingly, "to be independent and to know exactly what one wants." "Yes, it saves trouble," agreed Lady Caroline. "But one shouldn't be so independent," said Mrs. Wilkins, "as to leave no opportunity for other people to exercise their benevolences on one." Lady Caroline, who had been looking at Mrs. Arbuthnot, now looked at Mrs. Wilkins. That day at their queer club she had had merely a blurred impression of Mrs. Wilkins, for it was the other one who did all the talking, and her impression had been of somebody so shy, so awkward, that it was best to take no notice of her. She had not even been able to say goodbye properly, doing it in an agony, turning red, turning damp. Therefore, she now looked at her in some surprise, and she was still more surprised when Mrs. Wilkins added, gazing at her with the most obvious sincere admiration, speaking indeed with a conviction that refused to remain unuttered, "I didn't realize you were so pretty." She stared at Mrs. Wilkins. She was not usually told this quite so immediately and roundly. Abundantly as she was used to it, impossible not to be after 28 solid years, it surprised her to be told it with such bluntness, and by a woman. "It's very kind of you to think so," she said. "Why, you're lovely," said Mrs. Wilkins, quite lovely." "I hope," said Mrs. Arbuthnot pleasantly, "you make the most of it." Lady Caroline then stared at Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Oh, yes," she said, "I make the most of it. I've been doing that ever since I can remember." "Because," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, smiling and raising a warning forefinger, "it won't last." Then Lady Caroline began to be afraid these two were originals. If so, she would be bored. Nothing bored her so much as people who insisted on being original, who came and buttonholed her and kept her waiting while they were being original. And the one who admired her, it would be tiresome if she dogged her about in order to look at her. What she wanted of this holiday was complete escape from all she had had before. She wanted the rest of complete contrast. Being admired, being dogged, wasn't contrast, it was repetition. And as for originals, to find herself shut up with two on the top of a precipitous hill in a medieval castle built for the express purpose of preventing easy goings out and in, would not, she was afraid, be especially restful. Perhaps she had better be a little less encouraging. They had seemed such timid creatures, even the dark one, she couldn't remember their names, that day at the club, that she had felt it quite safe to be very friendly. Here they had come out of their shells, already, indeed, at once. There was no sign of timidity about either of them here. If they had got out of their shells so immediately at the very first contact, unless she checked them, they would soon begin to press upon her, and then goodbye to her dream of 30 restful, silent days lying unmolested in the sun, getting her feathers smooth again, not being spoken to, not waited on, not grabbed at and monopolized, but just recovering from the fatigue, the deep and melancholy fatigue of the too much. Besides, there was Mrs. Fisher. She too must be checked. Lady Caroline had started 2 days earlier than had been arranged for. Turn, page, turn. You gotta watch out for 57, 58. All right, here we go. Lady Caroline had started 2 days earlier than had been arranged for 2 reasons. First, because she wished to arrive before the others in order to pick out the room or rooms she preferred, and second, because she judged it likely that otherwise she would have to travel with Mrs. Fisher. She did not want to travel with Mrs. Fisher. She did not want to arrive with Mrs. Fisher. She saw no reason whatever why for a single moment she should have to do anything at all with Mrs. Fisher. But unfortunately, Mrs. Fisher also was filled with the desire to get to San Salvatore first and pick out the room or rooms she preferred, and she and Lady Caroline had, after all, traveled together. As early as Calais, they began to suspect it. In Paris, they feared it. At Modane, they knew it. At Mezzago, they concealed it. Driving out to Castignetto in 2 separate flies, the nose of the one almost touching the back of the other the whole way. But when the road suddenly left off at the church and the steps, further evasion was impossible, and faced by this abrupt and difficult finish to their journey, there was nothing for it but to amalgamate. Because of Mrs. Fisher's stick, Lady Caroline had to see about everything. Mrs. Fisher's intentions, she explained from her fly when the situation had become plain to her, were active, but her stick prevented their being carried out. The 2 drivers told Lady Caroline boys would have to carry the luggage up to the castle, and she went in search of some, while Mrs. Fisher waited in the fly because of her stick. Mrs. Fisher could speak Italian, but only, she explained, the Italian of Dante, which Matthew Arnold used to read with her when she was a girl, and she thought this might be above the heads of boys. Therefore, Lady Caroline, who spoke ordinary Italian very well, was obviously the one to go and do things. "I am in your hands," said Mrs. Fisher, sitting firmly in her fly. "You must please regard me as merely an old woman with a stick." And presently, down the steps and cobbles to the piazza, and along the quay and up the zigzag path, Lady Caroline found herself as much obliged to walk slowly with Mrs. Fisher as if she were her own grandmother. "It's my stick," Mrs. Fisher complacently remarked at intervals. And when they rested at those bends of the zigzag path where seats were, and Lady Caroline, who would have liked to run on and get to the top quickly, was forced, in common humanity, to remain with Mrs. Fisher because of her stick. Mrs. Fisher told her how she had been on a zigzag path once with Tennyson. "Isn't his cricket wonderful?" said Lady Caroline absently. "The Tennyson?" said Mrs. Fisher, turning her head and observing her a moment over her spectacles. "Isn't he?" said Lady Caroline. "I am speaking," said Mrs. Fisher, "of Alfred." "Oh," said Lady Caroline. "And it was a path, too," said Mrs. Fisher went on severely, "curiously like this. No eucalyptus tree, of course, but otherwise curiously like this. And at one of the bends he turned and said to me," I see him now turning and saying to me. Yes, Mrs. Fisher would have to be checked, and so would these two up at the window. She had better begin at once. She was sorry she had got off the wall. All she need have done was to have waved her hand and waited till they came down and out into the garden to her. So she ignored Mrs. Arbuthnot's remark and raised a forefinger and said with marked coldness, at least she tried to make it sound marked, that she supposed they would be going to breakfast and that she had had hers. But it was her fate that however coldly she sent forth her words, they came out sounding quite warm and agreeable. That was because she had a sympathetic and delightful voice, due entirely to some special formation of her throat and the roof of her mouth, and having nothing whatever to do with what she was feeling. Nobody in consequence ever believed they were being snubbed. It was most tiresome, and if she stared icily, it did not look icy at all, because her eyes, lovely to begin with, had had the added loveliness of very long, soft, dark eyelashes. No icy stare could come out of eyes like that. It got caught and lost in the soft eyelashes, and the person stared at merely thought they were being regarded with a flattering and exquisite attentiveness. And if ever she was out of humor or definitely cross, and who would not be sometimes in such a world, she only looked so pathetic that people all rushed to comfort her, if possible by means of kissing. It was more than tiresome, it was maddening. Nature was determined that she should look and sound angelic. She could never be disagreeable or rude without being completely misunderstood. "I had my breakfast in my room," she said, trying her utmost to sound curt. "Perhaps I'll see you later." And she nodded and went back to where she had been sitting on the wall, with the lilies being nice and cool round her feet. End of chapter 6.